Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Mastering Blueforce, the weekly series webinar. Today's topic is going to be on Blueforce Payroll Pitfalls, and this one obviously is for the week of March the 13th. Now, as we do with all of our calls, we do have everyone currently muted. So if you have any questions, any concerns during our call, please go ahead and ask those questions or state your concern there in the questions area of the GoToWebinar question control panel. And then from there, you can actually go ahead and hit enter or hit send, and we'll get that question and address it at the appropriate time during the call today. Now, as you know, our webinars are offered on a weekly basis every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. Central. And obviously, we do record these, and we do post them out on YouTube as well as on Gateway, our company intranet site. And then we also have all the documentation posted out on Gateway as well as another site called Google Drive that you can have access to download copies of any of the material I referred to today. But the main importance of these webinars, and to pass on to your team and make them aware that they should be involved as well, is that we actually use these webinars as an opportunity or avenue to focus on a key topic, to basically pass on the knowledge to you and provide those critical tools needed to efficiently and more easily master the Blueforce system. And in my copies here, I have included the actual links for those actual sites referred to. That way you can actually have them once you download them from the actual document here. Now, since we're talking today about specifically Blueforce Payroll Pitfalls, all those different topics within our pitfalls that we're going to be talking about deal with some of the daily time review, some of the pitfalls that surround that particular avenue. Then we'll also go through some of the pitfalls as it relates to edits, in which making edits between the time card and the timesheet. We'll also go through the pitfalls of handling pay rate increases and pay group changes. We'll go through a discussion on reprocessing timesheets, and then we'll talk about the final pitfalls of OTs, and specifically around OT settings that we have in the system. So all in all, a very important topic, because all these actual pitfalls that we'll refer to actually directly influence your compliance scoring. So I've used that term many times already, at least 10 times. So what is a pitfall? What exactly are we talking about when you hear or I speak about that term of pitfall? So a pitfall is defined as nothing more than a hidden or not easily recognized danger or difficulty. In this case, pitfalls are things we want to avoid when we're doing our Blueforce payroll. So everything we talk about today are things that we want to stay away from, and we'll give you some detail as to why, and maybe some alternatives of things we're doing bad that we should be doing a different way or utilizing a little differently. So let's avoid those pitfalls is kind of the theme of today's session. Our first pitfall that I referenced a while ago was our daily time review. And when we talk about daily time review, obviously that is the process that we stress to everyone, that we need to go in and review our time from yesterday or from the prior business day before within the next 24 hours. So within a 24-hour period, we want to, or by the next business day, we want to go through and actually review what our employees did, their punches, make sure there's no open punches, make sure there's no lingering invalid punches, and we address all those within that timely manner. So to that, the first point here, our pitfall under daily time review is really delaying or reviewing the process of doing that daily review. So big point there in the middle, don't run from it, just do it. Everyone who's an editor, submitter, and approver have that responsibility, not only to yourselves, but obviously to the employee, that we make sure that their time is correct. So the longer you wait, the better chance that you're going to forget to go back and add a punch. You know, right now it's fresh in your mind that John didn't punch in yesterday. So let's go ahead and fix John's punch. Instead of waiting for 2 weeks to the end of the pay period or a week, whatever it may be for your area, and then decide, oh, let me do it then. Or even more so, forget altogether, and John gets his check and realizes that he didn't get paid for those missed hours. So the longer you wait, the better chance you're going to go back and forget to do that. And secondly, the longer you wait, the less chance that you'll go back and fix or even inquire about an employee's invalid punch. If the invalid punch is occurring, find out, is the employee using the clock correctly? Are they calling in from the adequate or the appropriate registered phone number? A couple of things like that that you can go back and take care of sooner rather than later. Obviously, in all these different cases, I mentioned a manual punch, I mentioned an invalid punch. Both of those scenarios are still just gonna be multiplying in number the more days you let it go without actually correcting them. So, and in turn, waiting on that delay to not go back and make that, kind of speedy fix or correction, will stall your correction lag as well. So there's a lot of factors on that one little bullet alone that will affect your overall compliance score. So delaying the review of a time is that first pitfall. So as a refresher, we want to make sure that we review our time by the next business day. We want to make sure we clear up any open punches. We want to make sure we clear up any invalid punches. We want to ensure that the employee's labor is coded to the correct job, task, and/or work order as soon as possible as well. Because if you remember from our compliance webinars that we've had over the last several weeks, I've mentioned multiple times that this one task affects a lot of things. It actually goes and affects our management team's reporting, the monthly labor forecast. All those reports that we have out there are affected by the time that is actually the actual time that is calculated by Blueforce, and obviously in turn reviewed by you, the editor, submitter, and approver. So the first pitfall there is just delay, not to delay, stay away from delaying that time review process. Another pitfall that we often run into is the making of edits, time cards versus time sheets. I want to point out, and this is something I've talked about many times in the past, but want to reiterate the importance of where you make those edits for your time cards. And edits being, edit to an employee time record. So if an employee has worked, there is a specific location that you want to make sure you do your edits. So when we're talking about making edits, time cards versus timesheets, the pitfall that everyone tends to fall into from time to time is that we're making time edits in the timesheet view, which is incorrect. Time edits for employees that have worked must be done in the time card view. Now, there are a lot of things that come to play with this one major flaw, I guess you can say, of where you will actually make that particular edit. Now, keep in mind that time cards reflect the employee's punches. If the employee is punching in and punching out, that means that they are actually working. So that means that all worked hours should be tracked, should be maintained, is maybe the better word, in the time cards module. Now, the timesheets module is only going to reflect the total time the employee works after system calculations, including OT, pay differentials, and lunches. So the way it works, obviously, is employees punch in, the time goes to the time card for your review. That time is then calculated or said more compiled, and then OT rules are calculated as it goes over into the timesheet view. Now in the timesheet view, if you have to key in any time there, the time that you enter straight into the timesheet view is strictly the non-worked component. That means that if the employee didn't work, but they are entitled to time, for example, sick, vacation, holiday, non-work, any of the different PTO-related rate types we have out there, those should be done straight at the timesheet. And also any jobs that are considered manual jobs, which we have no way of collecting time for. They have to be a true manual job. Those jobs will be keyed in directly to the timesheet view. So let me reiterate here. Worked hours, time cards, all edits associated to work hours are done in the time card view. The timesheet view is only for non-worked scenarios. So keep that and timesheets obviously is a good place to review your time, but as far as keying in time or making any edits to time, timesheets are only for those non-worked scenarios. Now, one little bullet that I want to point at the very bottom, a little star that I put down at the bottom on the right-hand side here. Let me circle it for you. Keep in mind that the payrolls are automatically recalculated every time a change is made to any of the employee time records. Now, one thing I want to make sure everyone understands is that as employees punch in and punch out, the system is collecting that raw punch, meaning it's just taking whatever time they punched in, for example, 7:51, and tagging it into the time card, and they clocked out at 3:37. So 3:37 is now the out punch. Those are the punches that reflect always on the time card screen. Now, more times than not, we've noticed that a lot of editors, submitters, and approvers are seeing those times in the time card and making adjustments to them. For example, that 7:51 punch, they're adding it to 7:45 because it should be 7:45 because the rounding rule, right? Well, that is true. However, the time card view is only going to show you the raw punches. As I mentioned a while ago, as the employee punches in and obviously punches out, the system then summarizes that time, sends it over to the timesheet, and in process of going to the timesheet, it's applying those rules. So in this case, the rounding rule, the OT rule, all those different types of rules are being applied and will be applied accurately over on the timesheet view. So keep in mind, the time card is always going to be the raw punches. You'll never see any rules associated at that time. And then the actual rounded time, the actual time with OT, any of those scenarios will be applied on the timesheet view. So that makes a big difference between those two pieces. So in all, one thing to take away from this page is making sure that your worked hours always are being maintained on the time card view. So what I keep in mind is that the timesheet view, I want to reiterate one more time, provides you the employee's work time summarized with any rules applied to it. Now, every time someone goes in there, and many of you have had this issue at some point in your Blueforce lives, you actually try to go in there and edit some time on the timesheet. But you'll notice that sometimes the timesheet doesn't allow you to easily make a change, or it causes another scenario to pop up. And the main reason this is occurring is because the timesheet is always going to try to be right. Because we've set up rules in the system that say, when so many hours accumulate, then apply overtime, or this time needs to be rounded. So regardless of what you do, the system is always going to try to rectify itself and say, you know what, I have these rules I need to abide by. I don't care what you're telling me to do. I need to follow by these rules. So these rules are creating the havoc and distress to many of you because the system is always trying to apply the system-generated rule. Now, in that case, you then get to start playing this little game of, and it's not just a game, but a very messy game of tug-of-war, because now the system's saying, no, I think I need you to apply this rule because I've been told to do this way, and you're like, no, I need to take the lunch out here, but no, the system says, this guy says, this rule says if he works in 6 hours, I need to apply lunches. And then you're in turn, no, I want to take out the 30-minute lunch. And so you try to reduce 30 minutes. But you reduce 30 minutes, the system says, wait a minute, I still need to apply lunch, or it still applies the lunch on top. So you can kind of see how it gets really messy. And obviously the audit trail starts showing all these changes where you're fighting back and forth with the system. So bottom line, if there's anything that needs to be adjusted to worked time, that has to be done on the time card view. Otherwise, you're going to be in a little mess. And all these little audits that are occurring in the background, the system is tagging you with all these changes, that's affecting your compliance score. So word to the wise, worked hours should always go to the time card view. So you do have the opportunity, like I mentioned, to enter hours directly into the timesheet. But remember, we keep those to be the non-worked hours only, those PTO-related scenarios. Now, non-worked hours entered directly into the timesheet view. If they are PTO-related hours, you do not get dinged, you do not get counted against on your compliance scores for those entries. So non-worked hours have to be keyed in manual because there's no other way for the system to automatically do that for you. So it's important that you take those non-work scenarios and put them into the system. Now, hours should be entered with any lunch deductions or shift differentials in mind. So if your hours that you're entering in the system have shift differentials, lunch deductions, or anything, whether there be a non-work scenario or maybe even a manual job scenario where you're keying into the time card view, in those cases, you have to take in consideration those shift differentials and lunch deductions. So for example, if an employee worked 8 hours and that 8 hours included a half-hour lunch, then you should just enter 7.5. So that way you automatically took out that lunch for that employee. Hours keyed into the timesheet, and I can't stress this enough, do not run any rules. The rules actually occur from the worked hours as they moved over from the time card into the timesheet. So the timesheet is kind of a dumb timesheet at this point, because at this point, all the system is doing is it's taking whatever you tell it and applying it for that employee. So what the system will do is, Blueforce is pretty good about keeping the time card and timesheet in balance. So the timesheet will notice that, wait a minute, you just entered 7.5 hours for me, but I don't have any of that information back on my audit trail, back on the time card. So what do I need to do? So the timesheet is going to go ahead and push back 7.5 hours in this scenario back to the time card and actually create a time card entry that equals 7.5 hours automatically for you. And the catch here is, more times than not, that time card entry is not actual times that the employees may or may not work. Because what the system is doing is the system is creating a balanced punch on the time card view based on the employee's default shift and task setting. So that employee's default shift for a job, for example, let's say 7.5 hours for today. System is actually going to go back to that default shift, and the default shift for that employee was 8 to 4. The system is going to actually start that balance punch per se at 8 a.m. and run it for 7.5 hours, because that default shift that the employees should work based on that default shift setting starts at 8 o'clock. Now, as I've mentioned on many of our calls, is that default shift is nothing more than a label. It's just a label, the way we can group employees, so it doesn't really mean much. The system knows it's non-work. The Department of Labor audit were to come by and notice that the employees clocked in at a time that they normally don't work. Not a biggie in this case, because we have a document that is it's a PTO-related non-work scenario. So that's another big point as to why you want to make sure that your worked hours are actually entered into the time card view. So once again, that default shift that's available, everyone has access to seeing it. I don't have a screenshot or whatnot for it on this particular call, but you can actually go to the employee profile, and everyone has access to the employees. At the very bottom of that employee profile page, there is a tab called Default Shift and Task, to which you can now go in, go to that tab, and you will actually see the default shifts for every job that employee works. Now, on that default shift, you can actually go in there and edit that line and change the employee to the correct default shift as needed. But right now, the default shift really doesn't do much. It controls our lunch deductions, because each employee who has a lunch deduction is probably assigned to a shift that has a lunch rule applied to it, or attached to it, sorry. But other than that, it's really not in use all that often. It just depends on the different scenarios. There's some rules that can be applied at that shift level, but for the most part, it's just a label. So don't be panicked if you ever go back and see a time card entry for something that you entered in the manual time, you entered in the actual regular timesheet, but it was created kind of as a balanced entry to the time card. So for making edits, just keep in mind worked hours always in the time card, and non-worked hours over in the timesheet. All right, our next topic, our next pitfall, a couple pitfalls here, involve the handling the pay rate increases and/or pay group changes. Now, we all know that it's common that throughout our business, we're obviously going to increase employees' pay rates, possibly on a anniversary date or maybe per a union agreement for those that have unions out there. And obviously, pay groups don't tend not to change, but sometimes they do because of maybe a union employee going from a non-union scenario to a union scenario or vice versa. But regardless, these are two big key critical pieces that I can say that my team, our ePay team here, encounter every week, especially on Mondays when it comes to payroll. And it's because we have a lot of scenarios in which pay rates are forgotten and it's kind of a last-minute rush to get them in the system. Or maybe they are done, but the system is not reflecting the pay rate. Or maybe on the pay group side, there's a lot of rules that run associated to a certain pay group. So I want to address these two today in our webinar. That way we can stay away from these pitfalls, because these are big, time-consuming and pitfalls that just add to the stress of the moment when we're trying to do payroll. So the first pitfall, though, of these two that I want to talk about are pay rate increases. So pitfall that we always fall into is pay rate increases being made in JDE after the fact. What that basically means is, we're here on the 14th of March, and let's say we forgot to put a pay rate increase for an employee back on the 1st. Well, yeah, we're 13 days now past that date, and this employee's probably not happy if they already gotten a check in that time frame. So pay rates, just so you know, are updated every 30 minutes in Blueforce via interface. Now, these pay rates should be entered via your payroll admin or your payroll contact there locally at your different offices. They kind of kick off that process. Typically, it goes along with a PTF or some type of documentation that says that they are due a pay rate increase. Once we have that documentation, then obviously they'll go in and enter that information in JD Edwards, and then obviously JD Edwards then updates over to Blueforce via that 30-minute interface. And it's every at the top of the hour and at the bottom of the hour. So if we get a pay rate change in, say right now, and right now it's at 2:22 Central Time, we could actually go in, and at 2:30, the system will actually kick off that update, and just a few minutes after that, it'll be available for you in Blueforce. Now, Blueforce applies the new pay rate on the going forward basis. So that means even though you've told the system that the effective rate was back on March 1st, but now you're just now applying it today, the system is going to apply that rate for any time going forward. So that means the next time the employee has gone to the system and punched in for a new shift or a new day, the system will then apply the appropriate rate to that time. So any time that's currently on the clock or any time that goes back to the beginning part of the pay week will not be affected. And I think that is the big thing I want to stress on today's call, because that is one thing that a lot of us are forgetting, that the system does not go back and fix that time. It only goes from the point it's been accepted in Blueforce going forward. So that basically means that you've got to go in there and do some work. And I'm going to explain that here momentarily. And that actually takes me down to my next bullet point, which I'll show you a few more screenshots on this a little later in our call when we talk about reprocessing timesheets. But there's a function in the system that you can go in and tell the system, you know what, go out there and let's validate and make sure that all of our rates have been applied, make sure that everyone's payrolls have been updated. All that can be done through this process called reprocessing timesheets. But there is a way. Just keep in mind that if you knowingly do a pay rate after the fact, that's to your advantage to go in and do this reprocess timesheet. And I'll address this a little bit more momentarily. So strongly suggested that pay rate changes don't wait. You don't wait to do those pay rate changes until the end of the pay period. You actually do that in advance if you can. So the sooner you do it, the better, because the system just queues up that change and applies it based on that effective date. So if you know you have April 1st increases to do, don't wait till April the 1st. Go ahead and do them now. Get them in the system. Effective date of April the 1st, and obviously April the 1st comes around, everyone will be, pulling in to the correct rates when they punch in and punch out. Now, pay rate changes go through JDE one more time. Just keep that in mind. So it starts in JDE and then gets pushed out to the Blueforce system via that interface I was referring to. So that's pay rate increase, and I'll go through the process of reprocessing timesheets here momentarily. Before I do that, I want to actually go in and speak to the other little pitfall that's related to this. That's the pay group side. Now, pay rates are just pay rates. Everyone has a default pay rate system. The system knows in Blueforce how much that employee is due to get paid per hour. So that is the first part of the big puzzle here. The second part is the pay group. Now, the pay group pitfall that we get into is that we're not hiring employees into the correct pay group. When an employee gets hired, the pay group gets picked up and applied to that employee's profile. Now, from that, the employee then obviously punches in and punches out, but keep in mind that the pay groups do a lot of other things. The pay group actually runs the show for that employee, and quote-unquote runs the show because they actually applies those rules. It applies the OT policy for that employee. It applies any union rules. It applies a lot of different things, and it's important that we get that pay group correct. Now, pay groups are just like the pay rates. They update in the system every 30 minutes via interface. Now, the only exception to this is that the actual pay group is not applied by Blueforce until the start of the new pay week. So if I have an employee who's working for example, a non-union pay group, has been assigned to a non-union pay group, and he's been punching in and punching out since the beginning of the pay week, which was this past Saturday, and we're here already on Tuesday, we realize that, he's on the wrong pay group. But what you can only do at this point is either A, wait it out, because the rest of the pay week is going to be on the non-union pay group in this scenario, or we can go and put in an emergency help desk request, and someone on the ePay team can go through and help you revert that back to the beginning of the pay week. The system, like I said, will not go automatically do that for you. The system will automatically, a system being Blueforce, will automatically choose to apply the new pay group at the beginning of the start week because we have those payroll rules already running, and the system does not want to affect any of the current time or rules that have already been applied to that particular employee's timesheet. So in that case, emergency help desk ticket, put that in, and a member of the ePay team will assist you as soon as we can to get that rectified. But it's very important that we get that corrected sooner rather than later, because at the end of the pay period, or that following payroll Monday or Tuesday, you're trying to finish payroll, you're trying to close it out, you're trying to get corporate payroll to run payroll, and you can't because you have an employee who's stuck in the wrong pay group. That causes delays, it causes undue stress, and unfortunately, we have to get that fixed before the employee gets paid, in order for that employee to possibly get paid correctly. So one key thing to keep in mind is pay attention and be familiar with where your employees should be assigned to. So that being said, pay attention. When you look in the system and you see an employee assigned to the wrong pay group, don't be mum about it. Don't stay quiet. Go ahead and address the issue, and go ahead and put in a help desk ticket so that we can get that corrected ASAP. Pay groups, once again, they drive the rules for those employees. So it's going to govern primarily those IoT rules. So a wrong pay group could potentially pay the employee overtime when they're not due for overtime. For example, if you're working a 40-hour work week rule for overtime versus a 8-hour a day overtime rule, that can make a big difference, positive or negative, for that employee. Union versus non-union pay groups, obviously we want to know if it's union versus non-union because there's different union rules versus non-union scenarios. Holiday rules could possibly apply because we may want to see a certain selective holiday exceptions to be applied, or even other pay rules. There's so many different things that could be affected by the pay group. So it's very, very important that we get this, and like I mentioned there, pay attention to the pay groups that are assigned to your employees. Now, you can see the pay groups that are assigned to the employee from the timesheet view. That's the easiest way. I mean, you can obviously go to the employee's profile, but if you're looking and reviewing your time cards, your timesheets, you will see that on the timesheet view, you will see typically an item called group. And then there in the middle of the timesheet, you often will see the option for group. And that grouping is just a grouping of similar pay groups that belong to that particular job. Now, in saying that, those two pay groups that are in that red box are letting you know that the N, if you ever see a pay group with starting with the letter N, that means it's a non-union pay group. If you see any with the letter U, that's telling you that's a union pay group. And typically the union pay group will have the actual name of the union in somewhere in it. So in this case, in this particular example, you'll notice that it has SEIU in it. So right there in the middle, you see SEIU. And often at the very end of a pay group name, you'll have a W, a B1, or a B2. A W would just signify that it's weekly. In this case, I'm going to point to the B1 here. Oops, sorry, the B1. The B1 is actually letting you know that it's part of the biweekly first cycle, and the B2 would be a biweekly second cycle for corporate payroll. So that tells you a lot by the union name. I know sometimes it's, the pay group name. I know it's sometimes a little confusing because there's a lot of numbers and letters and dashes and stuff in there, but there is a method to the madness. The ends, once again, non-union versus union, and then the ending that typically tells you the cycle for the payroll period that might be involved here. So that's a quick thing on pay groups, but keep in mind, pay attention to those pay groups because the employees may or may not get paid correctly if they are not in the right pay group. All right, now reprocessing timesheets. Now this is coming back to what I mentioned, started talking about momentarily. There's a process in the system that basically ensures that the employee has the most updated pay rate and pay rule to their associated jobs. So what that means is there's a process that any of us on this phone call can actually go through and kick off on our own. An editor, submitter, and approver have access to go into the timesheet view and kicking off a process called reprocess timesheets. Now, the pitfall that we fall into as it relates to this is not reprocessing changes. And keep in mind that when we don't reprocess a change, the system doesn't know otherwise to go do it on its own. So the way it works is every time, and kind of understand before I explain what reprocessing gets us there, is every time an employee punches in, followed by a successful out punch, the system takes that cumulative time, spins it over to the timesheet, and on its way to the timesheet is applying rules to it. Once the rules are applied, it actually pops it into the timesheet view. So you know that every time an employee punches in, followed by a successful punch out, a paired punch, it's going to apply the proper rules for you. Now, that is why I mentioned earlier that a pay rate, once you go in and actually make a pay rate change, it's only going to go from that point forward with the next employee's punch in. So when the employee punches in again, the system knows, oh, look, this time you've got a different rate. I'm going to use this rate now, and as soon as you punch out successfully, I'm going to go ahead and calculate based on the new pay rate. But anything that's already been calculated for in the system does not automatically go and get recalculated. This is where reprocessing timesheets comes into play. It gives you the opportunity now to go in and recalculate and just ensure that the most recent pay rate and pay rules are in play. So failure to do so obviously can create a short pay situation. Now for most of us on this phone call, we're not really going to always know that an employee's pay rate was done late. We probably should be, but not always, given that we may not be that person who's in charge of the pay rate or submitting that paperwork necessarily, so we may not always know that, the timing of that. But as submitters, editors for that matter, but as for submitters and approvers, it doesn't hurt you just to click on reprocessing timesheet just to make sure that everything is done and updated before you go and submit and or approve your payroll. So keep in mind that to do this step is a very simple step. Located to the far right-hand side of your timesheet view. When you go to the timesheet view, if you look at your timesheets and go all the way to the right-hand side, sometimes you're going to have to scroll all the way to the right because this little column is hidden off the screen a little bit. You can actually go in there, click on Request Reprocessing, and then you're going to be prompted with a couple options. And these options are to either A, reprocess only open punches, which means only any punches that are still open out there will be reprocessed. Typically, I say ignore this one, because it's not a bad thing, but I'd say ignore that one. You also have an option at the very bottom that says refresh only rates. All that's going to do is going to go through and update the pay rates. I'm not going to do anything else. The middle one is the best choice. So reprocess all employees. What it does, the system not only refreshes rates, not only does it go in there and reprocess those open punches, but it also goes in there and makes sure that all the rules, any pay rules that may have changed, if we've changed a shift differential, or if we've changed an OT rule, or if we've changed anything that affects this employee, the system automatically goes out there and picks it up and reprocesses it automatically. Now this now ensures that you have back on the actual timesheet view, make sure that you have the proper total pay. Further down the left, you'll have some other pays and total hours and all that good stuff. All that is accurate now because we've actually gone off and run that request reprocessing option. So like I mentioned, as a submitter and an approver who will have to be in here on a weekly basis anyhow, it doesn't hurt you. Just go to your job timesheet, click on Request Reprocessing, reprocess all employees, hit Save, and run it for each of your jobs. It's just kind of a fail-safe and just one last thing you can do to be proactive in making sure that the employee gets paid correctly. And that takes me now into our last pitfall that we'll talk about today, and it's kind of different scenarios that are involved with around OT and OT settings. Now, so with that, just kind of keep in mind, With the overtime settings, just so you know that you have a couple different things that are kind of always in play in the background. Obviously, the first thing I've talked about today is the pay group settings and the pay group rules that are implied. The pay group rules that are in there obviously define the OT rule that's going to be applied to the employee's time. Now, that's just given, that's going to happen. But one thing that typically happens around the country is that we have this thing called a rate type called overtime that many of the editors, submitters, and phone calls, and some of you on this phone call, like to go in there and mess around with. And one of the pitfalls that we fall into is that we shouldn't be changing the rate type to overtime. And saying that, never change the rate type to overtime because obviously that affects some things in the system. The overtime rate should only be used by the system, only by Blueforce, during OT rule calculations. So keep that in mind. This is a hard-coded rate type that cannot be removed from Blueforce, and that is why it's stuck in the system. We just unfortunately can't make it unavailable to everybody because it's hard-coded in the system. So we have to live with it. So as a alternative to that overtime setting, we've actually created a different rate type for you to use, and this is the one that you need to use. Now, before I introduce that to you, let me stress that if you choose to use a rate type that we've created out there for you to kind of force the overtime, you have to keep in mind that by forcing overtime, you're telling the system that this time should always be paid time and a half, whereas everything else is still paid at regular. And keep that in mind. If that employee does not reach overtime, that time that you have forced into being overtime is going to be paid out at overtime. So I want to stress that before we go into your alternative here. So bottom line, first, stay away from the rate type called overtime. Now, as an alternative, use the rate type of OT move. And OT move essentially takes the place of the overtime rate type, because remember, overtime rate type, as I mentioned, it should only be used by the Blueforce system and system calculations. And by using it, once again, you guarantee that the employee gets paid time and a half for the associated number of hours worked. Now, the rate type allows you to force overtime, and I can't stress it enough, if the employee, let's say, worked 20 hours and for the work week, but you deemed the first 8 hours of that work week to be OT move time, or time that you want to designate as overtime, the system is still going to pay the employee's 20 hours at regular, but those other 8 hours that you've deemed as OT move as overtime. So the OT rule gets kind of thrown out the water because you've overridden it by forcing the overtime. And I stress that because in an age where we want to pay attention to the overtime and want to make sure that our employees aren't getting paid more than what they're due, and obviously in turn we want to make sure they're paid correctly, we should not be forcing overtime, just like I mentioned. Now, I do bring it up, although I say we shouldn't be doing it, I bring it up because there are some scenarios that warrant it, and we understand that. However, you want to stress that to your team that, and to obviously yourself, that you do not want to use this unless you are absolutely sure that you want to pay these hours at the OT rate. Now, as I mentioned, it's a danger. Just the simple fact that the rate type is going to affect that employee's entire hours that you've deemed as OT move. So just keep that in mind, that it is important that we pay the employee correctly in any case. Now, the dashboard reporting that we have in the compliance dashboards, for example, if you go to the ePay compliance dashboard and kind of drill down into a timesheet view for some of the different metrics that we have out there, you can actually go to that view and to that level and actually see, your overtime, when it was forced overtime versus system generated overtime. You can also see it's a lot better in the monthly labor forecast reporting if you drill down to the timesheet views. So all the scenarios will label when OT was in use and when OT move was in use. So bottom line, stay away from using overtime, forcing overtime, using the overtime rate type. If you have to use OT move, then you're more than welcome to use OT move as an alternative to overtime. And kind of what I was stressing here is to do that, you go to the edit timecard view. From there, you're going to go through and just simply edit selected time cards. And then from the selected time card view, you're going to go through and just basically, make sure the job's correct, make sure that the rate type is set to OT move. And then obviously at the very end, you have to put a reason code as to why you're changing it to OT move. And that's typically, simply as you correcting the codes as in rate type. So that's just a quick overview of OT move. It's a rate type that's available to you. As I've mentioned, stay away from forcing overtime unless you're absolutely sure that that time that is due to the employee should be paid at time and a half. Now, OT move responds a little differently in that the OT move will not show up as overtime. It'll show up as simply OT move. So when you go to the actual timesheet view, you'll see it labeled as OT move. So just like this on the screen, you see your 8 hours there for OT move. Now, OT move is just there because we want to know how big of a dilemma or how big of an issue do we have. I'm gonna call it an issue, but kind of an issue do we have with moving overtime. So we can actually go through and tell you which one is system-driven overtime versus Blueforce user-driven overtime. So you can kind of go through and see the differences. Now, one thing to kind of wrap up our overtime discussion is a setting in the system we call priority overtime. Now, in the system, all the different pay groups, and you notice I'm talking about pay groups again and getting those set up correctly the first time around, every pay group has a setting on it that basically allows the system to kind of help you drive and determine where you want the OT to go. So in saying that, setting at the pay group level basically preemptively moves the overtime to the employee's non-default job. Now, these are settings that you typically don't see because you don't have access as a Blueforce user to see the setting. But as a member of the ePay team, we can go through and actually walk through some more detail if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the pay group settings. But for each pay group, we have a setting on there that we can tell the system to give priority to non-default jobs when calculating overtime. So going back to the beginning of an employee being hired, they're hired to a default job. So one thing I will stress to the default job perspective is that default jobs are a 7-digit number. Default jobs start with a 5 and with 6 other characters, so 6 other numbers, so a total of 7 numbers, and that is a true default job. Too many times the employees are hired to a default district and not a default job, and that causes problems in the system because now typically they never work to that default district that's set up in the system, and secondly, this district job, and secondly, it also affects your working jobs because your working jobs, if an employee gets hired to a district level, then that employee gets automatically created with all these access to all the different jobs within that district. That might be what you want, but more times than not, it's not, because then the employee has the access to basically clock into any of those jobs in that district, and that sometimes causes other issues, which I won't discuss today on this call, but it causes other problems. So long story short, make sure the employee is hired to the correct default job in JDE. So when an interface is down to Blueforce, it populates correctly. Now, going back to this overtime setting, this setting alone basically allows the employee to properly punch in and punch out, but the system is kind of monitoring its overtime. If the employee hits overtime, there's a setting here that just says give the priority of that overtime to those non-default jobs. And the reason why this is done this way is because typically our employees are working contractual jobs that we obviously have to watch, our labor for. And if we need them to work at another job that's typically not their default job, then that's more times than not where we want their overtime to fall. I'm not saying that's 100% of the time, but more times than not, that seems to be where we want that overtime to fall. So you can actually kind of control that kind of in any way, shape, form from that perspective. But that is something that's already set up in the system for everyone. It's been set up since really day one. But I want to address that because occasionally you'll see that the overtime is showing up correctly where you want it, and sometimes you're just wondering, hey, how did the system know I wanted to do there? I wanted it there, and that's just because of the system setting that controls that. Now, from the time card, you'll actually see that the employee has punched in and out daily as instructed, but did pick up some additional work on a work order at different jobs. And this, for example, the start of the pay week here was back on 4/16, but you'll notice that the additional work was done at the beginning of the period, and that's typically, possibly the norm around here. Sometimes we want to get some extra work at the beginning of the week, and unfortunately, we start the week including that weekend. So occasionally, we have an employee out there that works time to a work order. Now, the way the system works is this employee, their main job is my main office. However, their extra work is being done on a job called Alamo Cafe. Now, when you actually take and review the actual timesheet, you'll actually see that the employee's non-default job is now getting the hit for that overtime automatically. Now, the employee did end up working over 40 hours that work week, so the system says, oh, well, then the overtime needs to first be applied to the beginning, those non-default jobs. So he worked 2 hours at each of those different work orders for that non-default job. And then he actually ended up working an additional 8 hours of overtime, which the system already applied all the overtime to the non-default job, so the remaining overtime goes to the default job that's out there. So that's why you'll see there in this scenario, we tagged those non-default jobs with the overtime on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. As the system approached that 40-hour rule for this job, for this employee's pay group, the system realized that the total amount of overtime in this case was 14 hours. So 6 hours to the non-default job, the remaining 8 goes to the default job. Now this is just because, keeping in mind that priority job setting is in place and actually drives where that priority should be given for that overtime. So all in all, this is just a quick introduction for those that may or may not have known of priority overtime, but this is one of the pitfalls we possibly get to because we like to move around overtime, we like to do a lot of things like that. But keep in mind, the system is trying to keep you honest here. If the employee does work overtime, and you always typically want it on a non-default job, the system will automatically do that for you. So it'll save you some time and some undue pain, I guess is the way you can say it later down the road. So kind of in closing, I want to say we offer support on any issues you saw today, and any follow-up or any additional questions you may have, please do ask. Just go ahead and reach out to us via help desk ticket, or you can call the help desk line and a help desk ticket will be created for you. We stress that to please always enter a help desk ticket. Obviously, it helps us on the ePay team, and we appreciate that tremendously. Now, in closing, just want to say thank you for joining us today for our call. We'll have the same webinar again on Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. Central. And then again, next week, Tuesday, Thursday, we'll have a different topic as a continuation of the Mastering Blueforce, the weekly series webinars. As always, we thank you for joining us, and we hope to catch you again in our next Blueforce, the Mastering Blueforce, the weekly series webinar.